So let's go ahead then and move on to Lindy Garner. Lindy is with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and is going to be speaking about invasive species. Lindy.
Good morning. Well, first off, I just want to say, same as others, this chapter was the result of several folks working together. So today, it's just me giving you a brief overview of this issue and setting the stage for the invasives breakout group in their discussion of strategies for solutions next week, so that we can continue to move forward in a cohesive manner and move the needle on reducing this threat of invasive plants. Next. As we talk about invasive species, we need to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. The formal definition that we follow has two basic criteria that have to be met. The species is alien, non-native, or exotic to the ecosystem in question, and the species has to have been documented as causing harm. So for our purposes in the invasive chapter of the conservation strategy, we are not talking about native species that are encroaching out of their normal area or abundance. So for example, like pinyon juniper or conifer encroachment, that is handled separately. Next, as an important note to remember, is invasive annual and invasive perennial plant species are categorized as either regulated species under state or federal noxious weed laws, or unregulated species, those that may pose a threat but have not been officially designated as regulated. So for example, in many states, cheatgrass is an unregulated species, or something like Russian olive trees might be unregulated. This has important consequences to management and working together. With unregulated species, often there are not state funds available because state weed laws may have restrictions for the use of those funds for only those species officially regulated or declared noxious. We can work around that through partnership funding, but coinciding with that, if a species is unregulated, it may also be viewed as a lower priority for action compared to regulated species, and can affect whether partnerships can get on the same page for a priority to attack it and address it. So that's why it's having these definitions clear is important. Next. Invasive plants in the sagebrush ecosystem provide us many arenas to work, unfortunately. We often focus on the invasive annual grasses of cheatgrass and medusa head as an example for Michelle's talk, because of their tie to the fire cycle and the voraciousness of how they spread across the biome. We have also got to remember that and recognize that there are several other species that pose a risk and are creating change in community structure or forage or in response to our management actions. Things like yellow star thistle and even old standbys like leafy spurge. Meanwhile, new ones are continuing to come in and spread, like bentonata to bulbous bluegrass, or things like tall white top and Russian knapweed coming in our mesic and wet areas. With all of these threats, it's difficult to decide what to work on and how do we come to common priorities to leverage our efforts with our partners. Next. As we think about how to develop common priorities, we have to think about which ones are causing the greatest impacts and where, while also thinking about where are the areas that are safe as of now from these impacts and how can we maintain those. So let's talk about impacts a minute. Most of you know and are familiar with the cheatgrass and fire cycle that Michelle just talked about, and substantially that wildland fire risk increasing through frequency and intensity. We must also understand what the levels of invasion of these annual grasses are so that we can identify areas uninvaded. So we identify where to work on prevention and aggressive management to keep those areas from increasing this fuel that ignites the fire, while still continuing to understand where those invasions are heavy and starting to move into a completely altered state where aggressive management and fire suppression or fire prevention with suppression activities can be planned. Next. Meanwhile, we also know the myriad of impacts of invasive plants to our ranching livelihoods and production being affected, wildlife populations being threatened, communities at risk of fire, to potential adverse effects on cultural practices, just like Drew mentioned. And the scale of these impacts are felt at every level, from the individual rancher or sage sparrow loss of nesting habitat, to mule deer herds searching for forage in migratory corridors, or impact to recreational opportunities, all resulting in an entire ecosystem becoming threatened and communities affected across the West. Next. So who has responsibility for addressing this significant and extensive problem across the West? It's the responsibility of a wide network from private landowners to state, federal, and local agencies, and each having a complex system of responsibilities, mandates, and authorities. The responsibility and authority to act is a landscape that is intertwined among all of us. So if this is who, then what do we need to do to work on this problem? Next. Well, we start eating the elephant one bite at a time, right? These are different pieces that all need attention and need to be addressed, and they depend on collaboration. These include policy, science, operations, and the cultural aspect of reaching people with messaging, and of course, partnerships. And we've made tremendous strides in all of these arenas by working together, as seen by a couple of examples listed within each category. Next. When we put all of this together, we are grinding away at this problem, with messaging and partnerships greasing the wheels for attention to policy, resulting in funding that drives operations. And we have the owner's manuals, the science for how and what to implement. So what do we need to do on the ground? And how can we improve overall coordination to move the needle? Next. We start with reviewing a couple of main concepts. First, we need to be talking about maintaining several species rather than just getting rid of one or two, right? It's about understanding how that plant community can persist and resist invasion and be resilient so that it can recover from disturbance. And we must understand what is driving the invasion. We can't just kill the invader, it will come back unless we address the driver of the invasion. Just like being sick, we can't just address the symptoms, we must address the cause, and we must maintain a healthy immune system. To do this, we can break it down into basically two models, two tracks: prevent new and early invasions and reduce the existing invasions. And it requires both to move the needle. First and foremost, we must maintain those native communities that have not been invaded yet and are most at risk. And we need to gain commitment and accountability for prevention and early detection and rapid response to minimize new invasions so that we don't add to our already overwhelming management burden. Meanwhile, we must also identify those highest priority areas where existing invasions are about to move into a highly degraded state, or where we can strategically place restoration efforts and be successful at reducing those invasions and increasing the native perennials. Both of these tracks or models of preventing new and reducing existing require partnerships so that we can have a broader influence for even greater success. So we know what needs to be done, then how can we move forward? Next. One recent roadmap was developed to help outline how we can improve collaboration and work together. The Western Weed Action Plan resulted from state weed coordinators, federal agencies, and private organizations and landowners getting together to come up with a high priority action items that the group felt would address those items that are preventing our progress the most. It was vetted and gained significant interest and endorsement by several partners like the Wildlife Society and the Western Society for Weed Science, as noted by the few examples in the lower left. It is built on the 4 pillars of funding, policy, collaboration, and research needs for a roadmap of actions. It is designed to be a living document so that we can have more communication and accountability by tracking accomplishments as they are achieved, or add new significant action items as they arise. So I'm going to now pull out just 3 of these action items that many felt are some of the top items that need to be addressed. And I'll give an overview for you to consider during your breakout session for strategies next week. Next. The first is to develop common priorities. When we look at these maps, the first 2 are basically hotspot maps, where the green and yellow are no invasion or lightly invaded. And as the invasion increases, it turns orange and red, and the map is based on the annual herbaceous layer at the landscape scale. So this is similar to what Michelle showed. So dark red is highly invaded, and green is very lightly invaded. The third map is a map from the state of Utah's Department of Ag prioritization tool that helps them identify where they should fund projects based on scope and extent of the actual occurrence data from weed mapping at the local scale, and criteria they enter into a tool to help them prioritize where to implement management. So how we answer this question of what should be our priorities depends on the scale at which we look at this problem, across the landscape, regionally, or locally? And how do we develop those common priorities? By weed species, by a certain area that is important, or by selecting those areas of invasions where we can be successful based on how big the weed problem is and the site conditions driving it? The answer is all of the above, right? But at each scale, it takes information on the invasion, site conditions, and communication to come up with the criteria to establish the priorities, and then commitment and accountability for partners to collaborate and get on the same page at each level. Locally, we do this often and work together and identify projects for common priorities. And regionally, I do through watershed groups, and like states right now especially, are starting discussions of how best to move forward and discuss common priorities, of which Brett Brownstone is going to be talking about with Oregon SageCon. But we have it really at the landscape scale. Next. Until now, the Western Governors Association has started a working group led by Bill Whitaker to focus on, for now, just the invasive annual grasses, and to try to develop a landscape scale spatial strategy. A few of our top spatial experts associated with the University of Montana and USGS and Colin Homer's work started working together to see how they could pull their information together in a map that we could all use as a common playing field. This is a brand new map of the cover of annual herbaceous layer within the sagebrush biome. These are the best data we have, and though it is not strictly limited to invasive annuals, it is an index, if you will, with an assumption that the majority of these areas are likely invasive annual grasses, though we know some areas are not. But again, it is the best science at the landscape scale that we have at this time. So red areas are high invasion with orange moderate, and yellow is light, and green is light to no invasions. You can see much of what we know already. Certain areas in the western portion, west of the Rockies and Great Basin area, are significantly invaded, while the eastern portion of the biome does not have as much invasion. Yet, we are starting to see more areas starting to increase to yellow and orange. But on both sides, there are areas of lighter invasion to no invasion, or the green areas. Now keep in mind, this is a coarse scale landscape map. So if you zoom down to local scale within those green areas, yes, there could be local invasions within the green. But as we look at this across the landscape scale, these are the broad patterns that we can use to identify extent of the problem and prioritizing together where we can deploy resources programmatically. Right now, each partner is prioritizing ad hoc and within their own scale and context. And we need to discuss approaches together, at least programmatically at this landscape scale. Next. When we look at the landscape scale, we can see the hotspots again of highly invaded in the green areas of less invasion. And at the landscape scale, just like you heard from Michelle, we have often and for a long time been making programmatic decisions of where to place effort and resources, but it has been primarily based on reducing fire risk. So the red and orange areas, and rightly so, this needs to be done to prevent wildfires. But notice how much of the ecosystem is not red. Yet it will be if we don't protect these other areas from further invasion, which would turn our yellow and green areas into new and additional red areas, which means more fire risk, more resources needed, and greater management burden. Next.
And Lindy, just a quick interruption here for folks that are listening. If you're able to hang on for just maybe 5 minutes after the top of the hour, I think we'll be able to easily get through the slides and then do our quick little wrap up. Pardon me, Lindy.
So if we think about the basics of invasive species management for a minute, this is the invasion curve with density of invasion on the x-axis here at the bottom, the cost of addressing those invasions on the y-axis here on the left. As an invasion starts, it is low cost and can be very effective at eradication and control if you attack it early by being proactive, pending site conditions, of course. But as the invasion increases over time, then the cost increases and we have to turn into a reactive mode of trying to respond with control and long-term management that are very costly and less likely to be successful. We can think about the health analogy again. Prevention is the best policy. Don't get sick in the first place, or don't let invasions in with prevention. To maintain your health, boost your immune system. or maintain your native perennial plant communities that are resistant to invasion. But if you do get sick, attack it right away and don't let it get worse, or work to rapidly respond to new invasions and aggressive management to prevent them from getting worse. Next. And as we make decisions of where to work or to maintain early and aggressive management, context matters, right? If we put a lot of resources into addressing an invasion in an area that is surrounded by other severely infested areas, we likely will not be successful, excuse me, or will need significant resources to maintain control because reinvasion is likely. So there'd be less of a return on investment. Compared to identifying areas less infested and aggressively maintaining that area as clean to prevent an infestation from getting started or worsen. We would be able to eradicate the infestation and less likelihood of reinvasion, so our chance of success is high and return on investment is high. So site conditions matter and the neighborhood of invasions matter. Next. So just as we talked about what needs to be done earlier in the presentation of preventing new and addressing existing invasions, this also applies to where we deploy resources programmatically at the landscape scale. We need to recognize that we need to consider both of these management models even as we deploy resources. If we make our decisions only from the fire perspective, we prioritize actions only in areas that are highly invaded or red and orange, and these areas are costly and potentially less successful at dealing with invasives. While if we also address where to place resources from invasion principles, we would include projects in that low to mid invasion level, the green and yellow, which is a significant portion of this map, and where we can be more successful, cost effective, and potentially truly stop and slow the spread. Just think about the map for a second. If we only focus on the red and orange areas, then while we are not looking, the green and yellow will continue to change to red and orange and continue to increase our fire risk and management burden. These areas of green and yellow are core areas that need to be maintained and protected from further invasion spread and can be used as anchors for more management to grow these core areas in a very cost-effective manner and truly move the needle on reducing the invasive threat. Next. These principles of maintaining core areas while still addressing the impacts of fire can then be stepped back down again to regional and local scale prioritization efforts. An example is Idaho's Cheatgrass Challenge state effort, where they identified this proactive piece as needing attention alongside the reactive need to address the severe impacts of the cheatgrass fire cycle. And Jason Pyron will be talking more about this as a case study tomorrow. Next. Since we've historically been more focused on the fire perspective, there's been a significant shortfall in the capacity of resources for invasive species management, even though these are often the fuel to the fire problem. So besides needing significant resources to address rangeland fires, we also need to stop creating the fuel to the fire and put some resources to invasives and balance this scale out a little more on the left side with dedicated, durable, and consistent multi-year resources and capacity, because they are needed, and we must identify how best we can do that at the landscape, regional, and local levels across all partners. Next. Finally, the last suggested action item is to promote cooperative weed management areas, or CWMAs for short. CWMAs are regional and local coordinating entities important for tactical operations in high priority areas. The map on the left is being updated as we speak, but these are pins of where there are or were CWMAs across the West. And on the right side, this map shows how within a state, CWMAs may be based on counties, watersheds, etc. CWMAs are a flagship design for action on the ground. They operate with common priorities, generally with a broad cross-section of partners, and make a long-term commitment that facilitate cooperation and coordination. Yet they need more funding, and maybe they are an entity that something new like potential investors such as industry might be able to buy into for local and regional efforts more easily if these were established range-wide. Maybe they could be integrated with the spatial strategies of the states and the Western Governor's effort to strategically focus on high priority areas and fill in the gaps. This type of partnership with common priorities is significantly important for getting more proactive management on the ground. Last slide. So what do we need from you? During the invasive species stakeholder breakout session, as you think about strategies to help address the invasive species threat, we suggest you think about some of the aspects we've talked about today, and how do we get commitment and accountability to move the needle. It's about changing behavior, right? We need more people to recognize the urgent need for action so that we can prioritize together that will result in increased management actions in targeted areas with consistent multi-year effort for success. So as you think about strategies, think about how we can establish common priorities across the scale of the problem, landscape, regionally, and locally, so that we are working together for the same measure of success and concentrated effort in certain areas, so that it's not a shotgun approach that scatters resources and reduces success. Then how can we include more proactive measures to anchor our conservation delivery and prevent additional costly invasions and wildfire risk, while still in lockstep with reactive measures that are needed for fuel suppression, depending on context of the problem and those site conditions that will drive whether you can be successful and get a return on your investment. And finally, how can we continue our great track record of collaboration while increasing capacity with additional partners or increasing the tool of cooperative weed management areas? If we are successful by leading and motivating all partners to work on these actions, then we will have a more coordinated and cohesive effort to move the needle on the invasive species issue.
Thank you very much, Lindy. That was a great presentation. And if you could hold on, and I'm going to ask Michelle to do the same thing. We do have some questions and I'd like to be able to get to them, but I'd like to hop over and just do the couple quick little wrap up housekeeping sorts of items. And then if we could come back to questions, that would be great. And those that may have to hop off, I just want to be sure they get the wrap up. So we're going to come back to your questions. Thank you, Lindy, for hanging on here for just a minute. So we are going to be taking a break here for a couple of hours. We'll be back at 2 p.m. Mountain Time, and we'll be taking our second set of presentations for today's session. And you have an agenda that shows you this, but we'll be talking about conifer expansion, mining and energy, free roaming equids, and land uses. So hopefully you will be able to come back to us for those presentations. You will have a different link, a different Zoom link, so do be sure to check your mail and join us using that other link. So next steps for those who may not be able to come back this afternoon, we just wanted to let you know that tomorrow we'll be talking about examples of successful collaborative approaches. We have a number of speakers who will be sharing case studies of things that have worked well for them in other parts of the sagebrush biome. And then next week we have breakout groups. Those of you who are participants should have already been notified. The active participants, others that will be listening in are welcome to do that. We did have a limit on our number of breakout group size. So we did need to limit who were active participants and who were listeners. Appreciate that. But do want you to know that the online engagement that we'll be having starting in early June will enable everybody to comment on what was developed in the breakout groups. So many more opportunities to come. And if you are participating in those breakout groups, the materials will be online May 11th. The website, the online engagement site is at the bottom of the screen, and that was also dropped into the Q&A box. So you can copy that link directly from there. So that is all we have for this morning. I do want to go back though to Michelle and to Lindy to answer the questions that we had. Is there anything else, any other questions that people have just generally about this afternoon that have a question? And Alan, I am going to go to you, or Liz, if you can help me get Alan unmuted, then we can see if Alan's question is about the wrap up. Any other questions about what we're doing this afternoon? Or Tom, do you have anything to add before we go to other questions?
Nope, just thank you to the presenters for excellent presentations and for staying on time.
Exactly, we really do appreciate it. Great presentation.
I thought it was going to be my dog, actually.
Yeah, that was awesome. Love the dog. Okay, let's go ahead then and go to questions for those who are able to stick around. These would be ones that started with Michelle and then to Lindy and then Alan. I do see that your hand is up. Actually, I'm going to unmute Alan first just because Alan's on the planning team, so he may have a different kind of a question. Let's see here. Liz, can you help me unmute Alan? And maybe while that is happening, let's go ahead. Michelle, if you're still with us here, we had a question from Sean Espinoza. Could Michelle provide an example of what fire borrowing actually is, and are there ways to overcome it?
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great.
And we can see you.
So fire borrowing is, and this sort of actually has been fixed just recently in 2018, but it was where, you know, the Forest Service and BLM fire management divisions had to divert funds from regular programs to help cover costs for fire suppression during extreme years of wildfire. And so actually in 2018, there was an omnibus appropriations bill that went through, and what Congress did is create an emergency fund, where rather than diverting money from other programs to cover the cost for fire suppression efforts, where we go over our 10-year rolling average, we would instead borrow or use that emergency fund to cover those costs.
Now I'm having muting problems. Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate you answering that. We have another question. This is from Dally Edmonds. And the question is, how can we address this cultural challenge? And I believe this was submitted on the question, it was one of your last slides. And you were talking about just the cultural way we view fire. So would you like to speak to that, please?
Yes, well, I think efforts like these would help tremendously. And also that last slide that I had, just showing a lot more integration between state and federal and other entities that really do help focus in on these other ecosystems that are burning as well. Whether that's for invasive species or for some other reasons. But you know, the shrublands, grasslands, desert ecosystems have definitely increased in terms of how much acreage is burning over the past 2 decades. And so really being able to all come together in a collaborative way and be able to address that.
Great, thank you so much. So there is a question, Lindy, for you, and also from Dally. Has there been any modeling done, or has any modeling been done to predict what might happen in the distribution of invasive species / fire under different scenarios?
Oh, actually, Michelle, you might be a little more prepared to answer that, where you're looking at different scenarios for invasion spread and how that's related to fire risk.
Yes. Has there been any modeling done to predict in distribution of invasive species fire under different scenarios? I would say that right now we do have the capability to do that. What has been kind of holding us back has been sort of these invasive grasses distribution maps that Lindy just presented in her one of the last slides. So we can take that information and actually start doing that now, but it hasn't been until just this year, 2 years ago, that all of a sudden these products started to come out at the scale that we need them to really be able to answer these questions, develop these different scenarios, and do some of that type of modeling.
Anything to add, Lindy? I would just mention, because people are talking about it, but then how can we take this information and do exactly what Michelle's talking about? It really has been a hindrance. And we even still have limitations with the layer of information that we have. But again, with it's the best we've got. And so folks are talking about trying to use that base layer.
Okay, great. Thank you both very much. I appreciate you hanging around to take those questions. And I have to mention again, Michelle, that Shane Green would really like to know if you took that last photo that showed the sagebrush and I think there was lupin in front of it. It was really beautiful.
I
You want to
wish.
admit to
No,
that? No?
I did not take that. Yeah, that was
Okay.
not me. And I didn't
Yeah.
put the copyright on it, unfortunately, but it is. It's beautiful. It's one of my favorite photos.
Yeah, it is a lovely photo. Thank you very much. So again, those are all the questions that we had brought forward to us here, and we'll certainly be noting those for the summary that we'll prepare, and that will be posted. And hope that all of you that are on the call still will be able to come back at 2 p.m. Mountain, 1 p.m. Pacific, and join us for our afternoon session. So with that, I think we will wrap this up and look forward to seeing you all in a little short of a couple of hours. Thank you very much.